Okay. Everyone can hear me? Oh, and on the screen there, is that confirmed, Evan?
Yes.
Okay, welcome to our second session. The topic today is Pharaoh, Haman, and other biblical adversaries. And so the idea today is to do, are there origins of anti-Semitism before the rise of Christianity? Many scholars look back, and start anti-Semitism as Christian reactions to Judaism. So today and next week's class are both devoted to the history of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish prejudice, Judeophobia, so all different terms that are used that are all before the beginnings of Christianity. Today, we're going to look at the biblical period, and next week, we're going to look at the Greek and Roman period. So the topics for next week will be the Maccabean revolt, the wars that the Jews fought against the Romans, and what was the nature of the prejudice, and going back to the definition questions that we were talking about last week, and about the spelling of anti-Semitism. There was a piece, I think, in the Atlantic that someone sent me that was a column on the spelling of anti-Semitism. It was just the topic that we were talking about. The reason why I want to refer back to that is the best way I suggest to think of anti-Semitism is that it is a prejudice or hatred against Jews that is specifically anti-Jewish, more so than hatred against other peoples that are minority or different. And that's the question we have to keep asking. Is there a special hatred, a special vehemence against the way that the Jews are understood that is unique to other types of hatred and prejudice? And that's the way anti-Semitism, the term, is generally understood. And if we can find that in other periods of history, then those are examples of anti-Semitism that we'll be following through the course. So we're going to start here with, get this out of my way. That's strange. It doesn't matter. I can do it here. We're going to start today with, so I can get my computer to work. There we are. Starting with the book of Exodus. So we want to start with Pharaoh. And this is preparing us for Passover, which is not so far away. Why did the Egyptians hate the Israelites? So at the very first chapter of the book of Exodus, it says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The story at the end of Genesis is the novella of Joseph, who rises to become Pharaoh's prime minister and is given great power, and under Pharaoh's invitation is able to move the whole family of the Israelites from Canaan into Egypt, and they settle in Goshen in the area of the Nile Delta, and things go well for them. The book of Exodus, their fortunes change. The Pharaoh did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people, I'm missing the close, but we'll fix it later. Look, the Israelite people are too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So this is what the book of Exodus puts into Pharaoh's mouth. These are Pharaoh speaking out loud to his court, saying, we have a problem with these people, the Israelites. So the problem are that there's too many of them. Now, obviously, there's going to be more Egyptians than there were Israelites. But part of this concern is that this minority is too big. There's too many Israelites, and they cause a danger. They cause a specific danger. They cause a strategic danger. And it's a danger that he phrases as an element of national security. That the Israelites are a foreign element, and that should there be a war, and should Egypt be invaded, then the Israelites will join the side of the invaders rather than support the native Egyptian government, Egyptian dynasty. Are we okay there? They're getting the screen share? They will now. Okay. I'll just wait, Evan to set it up there. They gave me multiple options there, so I don't know which. Okay. Not yet. All right. We pause for technical difficulties.
Were there other minorities in the area that moved in and?
I want to talk, yeah, there were before, so I'm going to get that. Yeah, that's exactly the right question to ask. Because that's the differentiation, right? Is it, is Pharaoh anti-Semitic, or is he just nativist? Right, just a nativist, he's just, just concerned about native Egyptians. That's exactly the question. I mean, it says you are screen sharing, the top there.
It does, but that's not what.
Are you recording? Yes.
It looks like it's on. No, Evan, it's on.
No, it's not.
It is. It's on your screen. It isn't on mine? Right there.
Oh, all right, never mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see your slide at home.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So Stacy's question was, are there other minorities? So the context is, and this we take a very, very broad look at ancient Egyptian history. The pharaoh, who's the evil pharaoh, is generally understood as Ramses II. Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, not because he was so great, he's a great guy, but because he built so many things, like the great palaces, so much of the great construction projects, not the pyramids, those were already ancient at this time, because this is the new kingdom, but palaces like the Karnak Temple, the statues at Abu Simbel, which huge statues of Ramses, that's like a skyscraper high. And it tells us right there in the first chapter of Exodus that Pharaoh turned the Israelites into slaves and put them to work building storehouses, and it gives the name of them, Pitom and Ramses. So Ramses is actually mentioned right there, not the name of the pharaoh, but the name of the construction project, but obviously it's named after that pharaoh. So most scholars assume that it refers to Ramses II, who was the construction pharaoh, because he needed labor, and he's using this. So the question is, some scholars say, is he using the hatred, the prejudice against the Jews? Is he using that as a way to get labor to build his construction projects? Or since he has to do something with them, he turns the Israelites into slaves. But what happened before the New Kingdom is Egypt had been invaded and was ruled by a people from the north called the Hyksos. And we don't know much about them, except they were foreigners from the north. And what is in the north? Canaan, the land of Israel. And we know that in the period of Ramses II, that was when the native Egyptian dynasty had regained sovereign control over Egypt and had over the foreign invaders. So during Ramses' period, the memory of Egypt being invaded and ruled by foreigners is going to be in people's minds. Now, the Hyksos are not necessarily the Israelites. They're not. It's a broad thing, and there's a huge debate among biblical scholars in terms of whether the Israelites are also called Hebrews and whether Hebrew was a greater term. There's a reference to an ancient people called the Hapiru, who were nomads and invaders, and is that the same word as Hebrew? It's really not the same word. But the general context is that there were other minorities, and Egyptians would have had a prejudice against foreigners from the north, which is where others came from. So it may not be specific to the Israelites, and it might just be a prejudice against foreigners, and that draws. But for whatever reason, there was a community, these Israelites, that are living in Egypt, and they're the ones that is attracting Pharaoh's concern here and his prejudice. So there are two I call pharaonic strategies. He takes two approaches for his anti-Israelite policy. Number one is from verse 11. This is all from the first chapter of Exodus. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. We'll call that oppression. And two, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. So that's genocide, right? That's kill all of the baby boys. So the first approach is prejudice. The second approach is murder of a people, which is what we call genocide. So there's a intent there, and whether these are mutually exclusive, the way the Torah presents it is that both approaches pursuing both. Actually, it appears that they made them slaves, and then there were still so many. So then Pharaoh said, we have to try something else, but not to the exclusion of them being slaves, because they're still slaves, doesn't want to free, wasn't want, and it's not just, and the other question is that when Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go, and they have the conversation at least 10 times, right, for the 10 plagues, right? At each moment, Pharaoh has an opportunity of expelling the Jews from Egypt. The idea of expulsion of the Jews is a theme that we're going to talk about when we get to the High Middle Ages, when the Jews are expelled from the various kingdoms in Europe. But here, there's an opportunity to expel the Jews because they're willing to leave. And Pharaoh doesn't want that. He wants to keep them enslaved. So there's this tension between the two policies here. Do we want to keep the Jews controlled in servitude, or do we want to kill them? And the alternative solution, which is Moses' solution, which ultimately happens, is exile/expulsion. Yeah.
Alan Weissman has a question. Did being an Israelite automatically mean being Jewish?
So it's a good question. Now, the Torah in this chapter alternates between the term Israelite and Hebrew. Hebrew is not used very frequently. It's in the Torah. It's used in the Joseph story. It's used here in the beginning of the Exodus story, and that's pretty much about it. It seems interchangeable. Some scholars think that Hebrew is a broader term, of which the Israelites were a group of Hebrew, that Hebrew was not a proper noun, but they are basically interchangeable. The word Jew technically refers to someone from the tribe of Judah. So it's not really proper to use the term Jew until the post-biblical period, right? Because the Bible refers to all the Israelites, which is all 12 tribes. So it's really after the destruction of the temple, when then you have the exile of the Jews, meaning from Judah into Babylon. That's where we start talking about the Jews. So that's the answer. So usually we don't, we prefer to use the term Israelites than Jews, because this is all of the Israelites here. Good question. So again, the policies here, and I want to talk about this idea of expulsion when we're going to talk at the end of the class about the Holocaust. There's a huge debate among historians whether it was the intention of Hitler and the Nazis to annihilate the Jews through genocide, or simply to make sure there were no Jews in Germany, to make Germany Judenrein is the term, pure of Jews. And it seems that originally, although you can debate what the intentions are, but originally the policies were to encourage Jews to emigrate out of Germany, though it was a little complicated because they couldn't take their money with them, so it made it harder to emigrate. And also there were attempts, there was something called the Madagascar Plan, where the Germans looked into shipping all the Jews to the island of Madagascar and putting them there, but it ended up being too expensive with the shipping. And there were negotiations between the Nazi government and the Jewish agency, the Zionist movement, to remove the Jews of Germany from Germany into Palestine. So there were a number of schemes that the Nazis were looking at to eliminate Jews from Germany that not necessarily mean killing them. They ended up turning to killing them, and part of that was because of the expansion of the geographic expansion of the boundaries of the Nazi Reich. So we see this tension here at the beginning, and I want to see how so many of the elements of anti-Semitism that we think of as peculiar to what we know as anti-Semitism really go back to the start of the story here. Now, I call this the otherness of the Hebrews Israelites. So using those terms interchangeably, because part of the discussion of the history of anti-Semitism, talking about the anti-Semites see the Jew as the other. And what does that mean to be seen as the other? What's the nature of that otherness? What defines the Jews as a minority? And this is a passage here from the 8th chapter of Exodus. And this is in one of their discussions, but the negotiations between Moses and Pharaoh, where Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron and says, go sacrifice to your God within the land. But Moses replied, it would not be right to do this, for what we sacrifice to the Lord our God is untouchable to the Egyptians. I'll go back to the Hebrew after. If we sacrifice that which is untouchable to the Egyptians before their very eyes, will they not stone us? And then Moses therefore asked, give us leave to leave Egypt for 3 days, go into the wilderness so that we can worship our God there, and then we'll return. When Pharaoh says, you and I both know you're not going to return once you leave. And then the story continues from that point. Pharaoh says, you want to worship God within the land, and Moses says, no, it has to be without the land. So that idea of within or without, defined there is the perception that from the Jewish perspective, of saying Jewish here again, and anachronistically, Alan, because this is our script, it's our text. There are no Egyptian texts from the time about the Exodus story, is that we self-perceived ourselves as other, because we wanted to be out of the land, not in the land. And then we see the distinction here of religious practice, that the Israelites wanted to worship animals, cows or lambs that were sacred to the Egyptians. And it says there that it would be an abomination, and so much so that the Egyptians would stone us because they would see us sacrificing an animal that they worship as divine. And so there's a clear statement there of a difference of religious practice. And behind the religious practice is a difference of cosmology, of understanding the way they relate to God, world. And if religion is understood as the rituals of the culture, a takeaway here is that the Israelites their culture was very other, was very distinct from the majority Egyptian culture. Now, underneath is the comment from Nahum Sarna. This is Nahum Sarna's commentary on the book of Genesis, about 1989, and we have the abridgment of this in our Eitz Chaim Chumash that we use every week. Nahum Sarna writes, untouchable is a deliberate ambiguity. The Hebrew word is to'eva, can mean that which is taboo to the Egyptians, but it can also mean that which is an Egyptian abomination in the sight of Israel, namely their animal divinities. He's almost making a midrash there, in a sense, in being careful the way it's read, because when the English says we sacrifice the Lord our God is untouchable to the Egyptians, so the Hebrew is ki to'evat Mitzrayim, because it is an abomination to the Egyptians, Nizbach Ladonai, what we sacrifice to God. Meaning our sacrifice to God is an abomination to the Egyptians, because we're going to sacrifice an animal or animals, and that for them is abominable. But what Sarna is suggesting is you could read it the other way. You could read it, Ki to'avat Mitzrayim, because we Nizbach Adonai. The abomination of the Egyptians is exactly what we will be worshiping, offering to God. Meaning the abomination is in our eyes because they worship animals. So we're going to worship that instead as a sacrifice. It's a clever comment. I don't think he's right, because I think it's clear from the context that that's why the Egyptians will stone them. The Egyptians will stone them because the Israelite religious practices are going to stir up such passionate hatred on the part of the Egyptians that they will attack us and they will stone us and they will try to kill us. Right? That's real hatred based on otherness. It's right there. And I want to focus also on the term to'eva, which is why I put it in the Hebrew there. So in the discussion that's in the rabbinical assembly that really dates back to 1992 was the first major discussion on the law committee on the question of gay and lesbian Jews. Can you have gay lesbian rabbis? Can you do same-sex marriage? And all of that discussion was based upon the verse in Leviticus, in chapter 18 of Leviticus, when it says, if a man lies with a man, you lie with a woman, to'eva is an abomination before the Lord. And the whole question is, what is it? Is an abomination? What does it mean? Why is it an abomination? What does it mean? What does that tell us? Now, the right wing, and this was argued by late Rabbi Samuel Dresner, argued that the practices of homosexuality were a crime against nature. That was to the right of the right in the spectrum of the conservative movement. The argument that was made on the law committee, even by the right wing on the law committee, was Rabbi Joel Roth, my teacher, made this argument. He said, when the Torah says to'eva, abomination, it doesn't mean an inherent abomination, meaning something that's objectionable in itself by nature. It rather means what he said is an attributed to'eva, that it is objectionable, not for natural, not from nature, but from culture. And then he argued that nevertheless, this was a Jewish culture, and the debate was whether that was acceptable. And that took the law committee another 14 years till 2006, when they then allowed the gay and lesbian rabbis, which are now permitted in the movement, and same-sex marriage is permitted in the movement. But I'm going back to 1992 here. The point was that Rabbi Joel Roth made is that he disagreed with Rabbi Dresner to his right. And he was saying that the term abominable is a cultural judgment, not a scientific judgment of nature. And the reason is he said, let's look how the term is used elsewhere in the Torah. The way it's used here, if we understand what I am saying is the contextual meaning, not what Sarna is suggesting, is that the Egyptians consider it a to'eva, an abomination, the way the Israelites worship God. That Israelite religion is an abomination because we sacrifice animals that they consider divine. Now we know that the Israelites would an ancient Israelite would never believe that the sacrifice of animals is an abomination, because that's the essence of the Israelite cult, right? That's the sacrificial cult, which is still at the core of our memories, what we're doing to add exhaustion in our mission study, right? Is the temple cult and the way they sacrificed animals. So the judgment of to'eva, even though the term is used in the Bible, represents a cultural prejudice, we should say. Now, the same term is used in Genesis. We're going to back up to the Joseph story. In the Joseph story, it says, and this is the point when Joseph's brothers come back to Egypt, and Joseph is still disguised as an Egyptian, but his brothers, he makes a banquet. They've come now with a Benjamin. It's the first time Joseph sees all his brothers, and he orders his servants to make a feast, a meal. And it says Joseph's servants served him, Joseph by himself, and them by themselves. For the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. Ki to'eva hi lemitzrayim, that it would be an abomination for the Egyptians to dine with the Hebrews. Is it because they're Hebrew? Is it because they're non-Egyptian? Is it because they're foreign? We don't know. Again, I'll give you the comment from Nachum Sarna's commentary. He says, the segregation of the Hebrews was due to the Egyptian feeling of racial and religious superiority that engendered contempt for foreigners. We talk about what are the ingredients of anti-Semitism. It's right there in the 43rd chapter of Genesis, hidden between the lines. This was also the source that Rabbi Roth used in his 1992 paper on homosexuality. He said, clearly, it's not a crime against nature to eat a meal with Jews. Right? From the Jewish perspective. It was just an abomination to the Egyptians to sit at a table with foreigners. Now, so I said it's and it goes back and forth there between the we and the them, right? Because it's talking about the Egyptian prejudice as memorialized in an Israelite text, because the book of Genesis is an Israelite text, right? So we remember the ancient Egyptians hating us. It's the same term as was used in Exodus, right? They hate us because we're different, and they won't eat with us. They see us as inferior. And is it for religious reasons? In Exodus, it was a clear religious theological differentiation. Here, it's ethnic, perhaps. It's just hatred of these other people. They're foreigners, they're shepherds, they're beggars, they're immigrants, all those things combined. And Joseph eats by himself because he's in disguise, but the Egyptians, his servants, won't eat with his honored guests. So moving along, we have evidence outside of the Bible that the Egyptians, in fact, were prejudiced. So this is a passage from Herodotus, the Persian Wars, when he writes, the Egyptians, one and all, venerate cows much more highly than any other animal. This is the reason why no native of Egypt, whether man or woman, will give a Greek a kiss or use the knife of a Greek or his spit, that means what he cooked on his stove, or his cauldron, or taste the flesh of an ox, known to be pure if it has been cut by a Greek knife. An Egyptian would never kiss a Greek. An Egyptian will not eat something that the Greek cooked. The Egyptian will not even eat something, even if it was just sliced by a knife of a Greek. The Egyptian will not touch it. Because the Egyptians are concerned that the Greeks cook cows, and the Greeks used their knives to cook cows and to slice cows, right? A steak knife. Those are the best kind of knives. So when the Greeks are thinking steak knives, and that's abhorrent to the Egyptians. The way Herodotus is describing this is almost a description of kashrut. The idea that what was the knife used for in its past? Does the knife remember where it was before it comes to my food? And if we go back to the previous passage from Genesis 43, the idea of eating separately. Throughout much of history, the Jews were criticized for keeping themselves separate and not breaking bread together with non-Jews, and that the kashrut code kept them separate. And here the Egyptians are being accused of it in Genesis 43 and in Herodotus, which is written many, many years later. So clearly this is an aspect of Egyptian culture there, but the Jews, from our memory, the Israelites take the brunt of that. Yeah.
Were the laws of kashrut already in existence when the Israelites were in Egypt? Because they were to be kosher?
Well, first of all, it says the Egyptians didn't serve the Israelites together with them because it's abhorrent to them. It doesn't say, it says, right, if we go back there, it says, Kitoe vahila Mitzrayim, because it would be an abomination to the Egyptians. It doesn't say to the Israelites. And secondly, no, we have no idea whether kashrut was observed then. I mean, even according to the Torah, the laws of kashrut wouldn't have been given until they went to Sinai, which is after these points. That's one of the explanations for the custom of eating dairy on Shavuot, right? Because Shavuot marks the festival of the giving of the Torah. So the idea is before the night before the Torah was given, they all ate dairy because they knew there were going to be these special rules and no one knew what they were. So they just played it safe. So then we get to eat cheesecake and, it's the result. Okay. So this is where we are with the Egyptians, the sense of prejudice based on cultural differences, historical differences, the association of the Israelites with the invaders of the past, and the ethnic differences. But it wasn't just directed against Israelites or against Jews, as Herodotus reports. It was a prejudice that was directed against Greeks as well. So I really raised the question: was there anything? Again, the Egyptians would have been prejudiced because they are the heirs of an ancient culture. And as I said, at the time of Joseph and Moses, if they existed, the pyramids were certainly there and were already very ancient. So there was a tremendous sense of pride in Egyptian culture, and when, especially in the period right before the story of the Israelites as slaves, which is when Egypt would have been controlled by foreigners, that's also an explanation of why there would have been that anxiety against foreignness that is represented in the passages we looked at in Genesis and Exodus and in Herodotus. Yeah.
Dennis and or Nancy Friedman are asking, Joseph was given an Egyptian wife. Wasn't that a way of accepting the Jews and family?
Yeah, Joseph was also made the prime minister. That was also a way of accepting the Israelites, but he was assimilated. He dressed like an Egyptian, right? So much so that his own brothers don't recognize him when he comes to Joseph, when they come to Egypt.
These are different pharaohs. So
It's different pharaohs. Yeah, no, but the question was given an Egyptian wife. That's the story of Joseph. That's Joseph's pharaoh. So, right, the later pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. And there's an implication that Joseph even knows things are going wrong, because when Jacob dies, Joseph's father, Jacob gets a whole state funeral and gets as a funeral procession back to Hebron so he can be buried in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah and Rebecca and Leah are buried. And Joseph dies. He tells his children, put me in a mummy, take me to when the time comes when you can, because I guess he already knew that they didn't have the same support as earlier when he was still at the prime of his career and political power. Yeah, but there's an assimilation, but the assimilation is also an important question. We'll see that at the end of the class today, that when the minority tries to take on the trappings of the majority, it doesn't, when they try to be accepted, it doesn't mean that they are accepted. Right? We certainly see that in the history of Nazi anti-Semitism, right? Because the Jews of Germany were quite assimilated. We're going to see an example of that in ancient Egypt as well. But let's move on to another passage of the Bible. When I said Pharaoh, Haman, and other biblical adversaries, the other, and I use the term other there for fun, the Amalekites are the paradigmatic anti-Semites. And there is a war against the Amalekites. When Moses takes the Israelites out of Egypt, you think now they said goodbye to Pharaoh, they don't have any more enemies. No, that's not true. They have a series of battles that they have to fight along the way, even before the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. But the big one is against the Amalekites. And there's two versions of the Amalekite war, one from Exodus 17, the other from Deuteronomy 25. The one from Exodus 17 is shorter. I gave you an abridgment of it here. It's Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. The Lord will be at war. And then at the end of the paragraph, it says the Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages. They fought the war. In Exodus, it tells the story. That's when Moses has to hold his hands up. So the Israelites do well. When he drops his hands, then the Amalekites do well. So Aaron and Hur kind of help him hold his hands up. And then the Israelites prevail. And God says, blot out the memory of Amalek. But God will be at war with Amalek through the ages. So the narrator tells us that these are our permanent enemies. The Amalekites are the bad guys. And then it doesn't tell us then why they fought with us. It just says they're our enemies. Deuteronomy gives us more. So Deuteronomy says, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey. And this is what Amalek did after you left Egypt. How undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march, meaning he didn't follow the ethics of war. It wasn't just that they decided to attack us. It's that they were undeterred by fear of God, meaning they broke basic ethics and surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. They attacked from the back. The clear indication, and the phrase undeterred by fear of God, means this was an evil act. It was not a legitimate means by the normal laws of war. And we always argue, what does it mean? How could there be a laws of war? Because war is the breakdown of diplomacy. But this is an ancient text that clearly indicates that there were standards that were followed in war, and here it was violated by Amalek according to Deuteronomy. Therefore, when the Lord grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek. Meaning, we just fought this war now in the desert, we won, but the Amalekites are going to be our permanent enemy. When we have the opportunity, we will then finish it. So it's left there. And this idea of this passage, actually, Deuteronomy 25, is the passage of the Torah that is read in what's called Shabbat Zachor, Shabbat of memory, because it says, remember what Amalek did. And it's always a Shabbat right before Purim. And we're going to see about Haman and Haman's connection with Amalek. And it's considered, of all of the Torah readings of the year, this is considered the one that there is a specific mitzvah more than any other to hear this specific Torah reading. Because it says the way we fulfill the mitzvah of remembering what Amalek did is by hearing this passage in Shul on the Shabbat before Purim. So it's considered the most important Torah reading of the year. But it's always important to read Torah, but here it's this specific portion. And whenever rabbis give sermons about anti-Semitism, they always talk about Amalek, and they give their anti-Semitism sermon on Shabbat Zachor. Now, the end of the passage of Deuteronomy, it says, when the Lord grants you safety from all your enemies. Now, that's also insignificant. very significant, meaning there are other enemies. When we're saved from the regular enemies, then we're going to deal with the arch anti-Semites, the Amalekites, because they'll always be lurking there, even when we have peace from the others. And then when does that happen? It happens after the Israelites are established in the land. So that's a foreshadowing of what I call Amalekite War II. And Amalekite War II is described in the 15th chapter of the first book of Samuel. This is actually the Haftorah on Shabbat Zachor that we read after we read the passage from Deuteronomy. And Samuel the prophet approaches King Saul and gives Saul the command, thus said the Lord of hosts, I'm exacting penalty for what Amalek did to Israel for the assault he made on the road on their way from Egypt. Now go attack Amalek, Samuel said. Bring forward to me King Agag of Amalek. Saul destroyed Amalek. He captured King Agag Amalek alive, but Samuel was unhappy that he didn't. He was supposed to bring the king dead, not dead or alive. He didn't kill the king, and he kept the women, the children, the cattle. He was supposed to destroy everything. Samuel's very angry at Saul. They have a big fight. After this, they don't see each other again. Things go badly for Saul. But that's not what I want to focus on for today. Focus on that says, so Saul brings King Agag of Amalek alive, and Samuel then, the king of the Amalekites, King Agag, is standing before Samuel the prophet. And Samuel says, as your sword has bereaved women, so shall your mother be bereaved among women. Right? Your sword bereaved women because you have caused so much pain and suffering in the world and killed so many innocent people, is the assumption. And then Samuel cut Agag down before the Lord at Gilgal. So these are selections from 1 Samuel 15. Yeah.
Jerry Behrens says, so we observe the commandment to blot out the memory of Amalek by elevating the reading about the Amalekites to a preferred position.
Yes, correct. Because blot out the memory is a phrase that means destroy them. So blotting out the memory was the command in the Torah for what King Saul and then Samuel did. Remember Amalek is the command for us, which we fulfill by reading the Torah. Between the two aspects, I'd rather read the Torah than slaughter the Amalekites. So we got the better part of the deal. But that is always strange. Don't forget, remember, there is a tension there as well. Yeah.
So Amalek is anti-Semitic. Is that what you're inferring from this?
It's considered the worst because the reason, let me go back to the Deuteronomy passage. When the Lord grants you safety from all your enemies, then you're going to deal with an Amalek, meaning Amalek is worse than the regular enemies. The regular enemies might have legitimate issues with us. It's life, it's history. You have those arguments, there's disagreements. But Amalek broke the normal. It was particularly heinous. They attacked in the rear. When rabbis give their Parshat Zachor sermon, they usually talk about Amalek as the founders, the original terrorists, right? Because they attack innocent civilians rather than military targets. It's often understood in those terms. And you can see the Torah. So there's the sense that it is, if we understand anti-Semitism as something that is a peculiar prejudice, not above the range of normal hatreds, if there's such a hatred as hatred normal, the Amalekites are separate. And the other reason why the Amalekites considered the founders, the original anti-Semites, is, well, actually, hold on to this. Let's hold on that thought a second. This is a quotation from the beginning of the 83rd Psalm. And it's a psalm about the enemies of Israel. It says, "O God, do not be silent, do not hold aloof, do not be quiet, O God, for your enemies rage, your foes assert themselves. They plot craftily against your people. Take counsel against your treasured ones. They say, let us wipe them out as a nation. Israel's name will be mentioned no more. Unanimous in their counsel, they have made an alliance against you, the clans of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gabal, Ammon, and Amalek, Philistia and the inhabitants of Tyre, Assyria too joins forces with them." There's a whole list of enemies. Amalek is included among them. They're particularly dangerous to us because they want to wipe us out as a nation. Now, this intent of genocide, of destroying a nation, again, that's also hyperbole of ancient texts. There was the first mention of Israel. I didn't put this in the slides. It's called the Stele of Merneptah. So Pharaoh, probably at the time that those Israelites who were slaves in Egypt were in Egypt. And it says, I fought a war against Israel, I've destroyed Israel, its seed is no more. The sense is not just a victory, it's not just a defeat, but it's an annihilation of a people. So that is, hyperbole is used, but so Amalek is not being distinct, separated out, but it's put in a list of other people that their intention is to destroy us. So what are and that's the context. But now, what's special about Amalek? It's that wicked, wicked man. Haman was his name. Because it says Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. That's what Haman is first. That's the first mention of Haman in the book of Esther. And Purim comes right before Passover. And a lot of people point there is the connection there, right? There's a connection between Haman and Pharaoh. And we kind of got, and the connection is Amalek. Amalek is the bridge between Pharaoh and Haman. Because Amalek is the first war right when we leave Pharaoh when we're in the desert. And Haman is an Agagite. King Agag of Amalek was the Amalekite king that King Saul and Samuel fought against, that Samuel killed. So if you understand, so knowing the first Samuel story about what they call Amalekite War 2, we know that Agag is Amalek. Haman is an Agagite, therefore Haman is an Amalekite. And the interesting thing is, why doesn't it just say the Amalekites? Could be, said blot out the name. Like we blot out the name Haman when we do the drivers. But the Megillah doesn't even want us to tell us the name Amalek. That's the real bad name. Amalek doesn't even appear there. So, and then Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews. Lahashmida to Yahudim. Now, Alan mentioned the word Jew. The book of Esther is one of the only place in the Bible that it uses the term Jews, because it's a rather late book, probably written at the end of the Persian period. Some people date its meaning of the Hellenistic period. It's the end of the Persian period. We're going to say 5th century, late 5th century BCE. And he wants to destroy the Jews, is the story of Haman. Now, what reason did Haman give to the king, to Ahasuerus, for why he wants to destroy the Jews? The words that the book of Esther puts in Haman's mouth are very telling. I want to look as closely. This is from the 3rd chapter of the book of Esther. There is a certain people, a particular people, scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm. So we're a people that's dispersed in the diaspora, and that's almost a negative term. Doesn't say the Jews, doesn't name us. The fact that we're dispersed means that we don't have our own country. And the dispersion is almost like a judgment of history / God, that this people has been cursed. Later in the Christian anti-Judaism will often point out that the dispersion of the Jews, the exile of the Jews, the destruction of the temple by Titus are signs that God no longer favors the Jews. Signs of the superiority of Christianity, because the fact that the Jews are dispersed is a sign that they no longer have God's favor. Way before Christianity, Haman's already saying that to Ahasuerus. They were dispersed, whose laws are different from those of any other people. They follow their own customs. They do not obey the king's laws. It is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. Now, the only law that we know that got Haman angry was because Haman passed a decree that everyone had to bow down to him, and Mordecai refused to bow down to him. Technically, that was a decree of the king because Haman was the prime minister. But it was, it doesn't mean they generally flouted the laws of the king. In fact, Esther also tells us that Haman defended the king's life in finding out about a plot against the king. But Haman represents the Jews as disloyal, which is always the charge of anti-Semitism. We think to this day, right, the charge of Semitism, the charge of dual loyalty, right? Can the Jews really be loyal? Can a Jewish member of Congress really be a representative of the United States Congress and is not really more loyal to Israel? So there's that charge of loyalty there. That if it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for the deposit in the royal treasury. So the final argument against the Jews is economic advantage. I'm going to give you a bribe. It'll be in your, because he says it's not in your interest to tolerate the Jews. It is in your interest to let me kill them, because I'm going to give you 10,000 talents, which is a lot more than $10,000. So this is the argument that he gives there. Is that different people, they are other, they are not us. They follow their own ways. They are not really loyal. History has already judged against them. Let's just wipe them out. Why does Haman hate them so much? What other reason that's not written here does the book of Esther, the story of Purim, give us for why Haman hates the Jews so much? He's insecure. Mordecai won't bow down to him. And there's that sense of, it's not that they don't respect the king, it's that they don't respect him. And that Haman's insecurity, right, for his own position, when he wants the king to honor him and then he has to honor Mordecai. That's what drives the hatred, gets him so angry. If we had the chance, we would look closer at these elements in the book of Esther. And the book of Esther is the most important book in the Bible in terms of the history of anti-Semitism. It's used throughout history. The idea of the celebration of Purim with the wearing masks and then it's the carnival aspect of turning things upside down. The story of Purim is almost a farce in the Jews being powerful against and destroying the ones who wanted to kill them, which was a very redemptive holiday throughout, especially the periods of Jewish history where the Jews were terrified about the non-Jews whom they lived amongst. And the hatred of the other is driven by sort of a mirror also, right? What are my own insecurities and my own identity that I see in the other? And then I'm going to relay that on the other and hate that person. And by destroying that person, it'll make me feel more secure in who I am. Again, it's a psychological reading. You tell me if I'm good at that or not, a resident psychologist. But that's one way to read Haman there. Okay, so while this is going on, and whether it's an actual historical story is irrelevant, right? Whether it actually happened that there was an attempt. There's so much of the book of Esther that reads like a fiction. It doesn't matter whether it really happened or what happened. The point is, it's a story that the Bible preserved of this sense that the Jews are always in danger because there are people that hate us and that want to go so far, not only oppress us as Pharaoh's first strategy, but destroy us and kill us, which was Pharaoh's second strategy, if the first one didn't work. And it's only because of luck, right, that we were, or because of our piety that we were saved. And that insecurity of Jewish existence vis-a-vis the surrounding hatred is a part of the story of Jewish identity, and not just the story of the outside world. So while this is set, while the book of Esther is written, when it supposedly happened, the end of the Persian period, there is something going on very important for our story back in Egypt. In Egypt, and the island of Elephantine, which it was in the original, I don't know why it lost on the map. It's down there, all the way in Lower Egypt, near the city of Aswan. And it's an island in the middle of the Nile where there was an Israelite garrison that was established during the late First Temple period. And it was a military garrison that was originally established in the probably the late 7th century BCE, where the Jews who were put by the king of Israel, the king in Jerusalem, to assist Egypt because they were allied with Egypt against the Babylonians, against the Assyrians, the invaders from Mesopotamia. But this was actually in the south of Egypt to secure Egyptians against their southern border, against the Ethiopians and Nubians. So, and in the late 19th century, there were a number of papyri that were discovered from the Jewish community in this fortress, on Elephantine Island. And of that, there is one of the most important papyrus that was found is called the Passover Letter, and it dates to 419 BCE. Now, you also need to know before we read that, is that one of the important things about the Jewish establishment in Elephantine is that they had a temple. where they performed sacrifices, and that temple has existed until the time it was destroyed in 410, which we're going to get to. So this was outside of Jerusalem. It was another temple, and there's so much scholarship studies the papyri in terms of what it says about different forms of Israelite religion. That's not similar, but not quite the same as what we know from the Bible. But what does this Passover letter say? To my brothers, Gedaliah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah. So Hananiah is a Jew who is coming and has authority representing the Persian king. And he's sending this to the Jewish community, or writing this letter, presenting it to the Jewish community in Elephant's time. And he says, may God, or the gods, depends on how it's interpreted. All of this, I should say, is based on a reconstruction of scholars. And the papyrus is a lot of ends of words or phrases that are missing, and this is their best sense of what it says. I mean, scholars put certain of it in brackets to show you what they're filling in, what they're not. To make it simpler, I just put the text here. Seek after the welfare of my brothers at all times. And now this year 5 of the King Darius. Darius is the Persian king. So the king is in Iran. This is the Persian Empire, extends from Iran all the way to Egypt. And because it's this king in Persia is sovereign, that's why you date years according to his reign. It has been sent from the king to Arsames the prince. Now Arsames is the Egyptian head in Elephantine, the Egyptian governor or provincial head, saying, keep away from the Jewish garrison. We'll come back to that. Now, you thus count 14 days in Nisan. That's how we know it's a Jew to a Jew, because it's dealing with the Jewish calendar. On the 14th at twilight, observe the Passover. And from the 15th until the 21st day of Nisan, observe the festival of unleavened bread. 7 days eat unleavened bread. Now be pure and take heed. Do not work on the 15th day until the 21st day of Nisan. Do not drink any fermented drink. That means beer. That's comments, you know. Do not eat anything of leaven. Notice how abstaining from beer is the first thing. Then not eating bread comes second. Right? Do not eat anything of leaven, nor let it be seen in your houses. Right? You can't even own it. You can't even have it. From the 14th day of Nisan at sunset until the 21st of Nisan at sunset. Bring into your chambers any leaven which you have in your houses and seal them up during these days. Okay, so you just had to be hidden away. It doesn't, later halacha requires you to not have it in your possession at all. By order of the God of heaven and by order of the king. To my brothers, Gedaliah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah, son of Pan. Now, this idea of the order of the God of heaven and by order of the king, I read as sort of like a Thanksgiving proclamation. When the mayor, the village of Ridgewood declares, observe Thanksgiving. We don't need the village to tell them Thanksgiving. We're going to do it anyway. We know what to do, but yet it's pronounced by the government. And you have this sense, and this is by the authority of the king of Persia, that the Jews to observe Passover, and it gives us details of the observance of Passover. The phrase that's important for us is this phrase right here: keep away from the Jewish garrison. That command is going to Arsames, who's the Egyptian or Persian provincial leader. Why? Why would he say that? To think about later Jewish history, when was the most dangerous time for a Jew to be a Jew? What was the most dangerous week of the year to be Jewish in European history? Passover, right? Because they're going to blame us. That's for killing Jesus, and then the most dangerous time where you were liable to have a pogrom was on Passover. So, and very often you had the king send letters to the local rulers, to the police chief, saying, keep people away from the Jews. They have the right to observe their Passover. Don't bother them. Here, you have the same thing, but it has nothing to do with Christianity. Right? This is way before. This is in 419 BCE. Now, BCE is because we want to be universal, but just like in BC, right, before Christ, 419 years before Jesus, stay away from the Jews on Passover. Because the assumption is that when the non-Jews and the Egyptians mix with Jews, they're gonna be angry and they're gonna attack the Jews. And it happened. And it happened 9 years later. 9 years later, the temple was destroyed. And this is from a text, a papyrus that was written in about 5-6 years later in 404. It tells the story of the destruction of the Elephantine temple. In the month of Tammuz, years 14 of King Darius, when Arsames had departed and gone to the king. So Arsames was the local ruler who was always ordered by the king to keep the peace on Passover. He had to go to Persia then, and he was absent. And then all hell broke loose. The priests of Knub, the god, who are in Elephantine, the fortress, in agreement with Bidranga, who was the chief here, in charge now that Arsames was away, said, let them remove from there the temple of, now it doesn't say Yud He Vav He, it's just Yud He Vav. So it's missing the end of God's name, but it's obviously God. The God which is in Elephantine, the fortress. So now that Arsames is away, they decide to attack the temple. And now this is the temple of Knub, which is the Egyptian temple that was right next door. They had theoretically lived together in tension for this time. Now, then Bidranga the wicked, like Haman, the wicked man, right? Bidranga Harasha, sent a letter to Nafani, his son, who was garrison commander in Sen, the fortress, saying, the temple which is in Elephantine, the fortress, let them demolish. And then Nafani led the Egyptians with the other troops. They came to the fortress of Elephantine with their weapons. They broke into the temple, demolished it to the ground. The stone pillars which were there, they smashed them. But the gold and silver basins, the other things which were there in the temple, those they took and made their own. And so they took the gold and the silver. It's like, this is the first pogrom, right? They attacked the synagogue, but they took the silver from the Torahs and they brought those home. That's exactly what happened here. This is the first recorded pogrom. This is the first incident of violent anti-Semitism in history that we have recorded from 419 BCE. That's how long it goes back. Happened many, many times since then. We think of Kristallnacht as the attack of the synagogues in Germany, but it goes back to 419 BCE. Now in what's left, let me just unpack this a little bit in just a few minutes. If there was no anger about Jews because of the crucifixion, because this is pre-Christian, why? Because it's associated with Passover. Because in the Passover letter, right, it says, stay away from them on Passover. So they always knew that Passover was such. So why would the Egyptians be riled up to attack the Jews on Passover?
Pharaoh.
Because Pharaoh, right? the Jews are celebrating Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh, 10 plagues. Finally, we killed his kid, and he suffered. He got boils. So it's almost like the Purim story. It's like making fun of the non-Jews. And here the Egyptians are, it's always like, how do you celebrate Passover in Egypt? So there's this sense that the Jews are seeing them. The Jews dare to see themselves as superior to us. They're in our country. That's part of it. Any other ideas? And yeah.
Isn't there a military aspect to this? We're talking about garrison.
Yeah.
What would be the feeling, a national feeling in a country, having a foreign garrison in the middle of your country?
Right. And that's a good point, right? So I don't know if everyone heard that is a military aspect, because how would the Egyptians feel about a foreign garrison in their country? What makes it complicated is this is a very complicated triangle. It's not a love triangle, right? It's between the Egyptians, the Jews, and the Persians. The Persians are the empire, and the Jews are protected by the imperial authority from Persia. But the local Egyptians are a command, and they serve the interest of Persia, because Egypt is not sovereign now. It's a part of the Persian Empire. But they can't rebel against Persia. So instead they rebel and they attack the local Jews that are only loyal to the Persian king. And this is a story that's repeated down the line. So there's the ethnic rivalries about Pharaoh, and there's the political military dimensions. So it's not that the garrison is a military threat because the Egyptians aren't sovereign either. It's the fact that part of it is their resentment against the imperial authority. And some of the other texts, and we have time, we could have looked more, that there are other papyri that say that when there was a time when the Egyptians broke off for a small period of time, they were able to rebel successfully against Persia before Darius. It said that the Jews did not join in the rebellion. The Jews stayed loyal, and this is a Jewish strategy that follows through all of Jewish history. That the Jews, when they're in an empire, they will always be loyal to the central imperial authority, and the imperial authority will always try to protect the Jews as representing their interests against the local population that the central authority is trying to control. The Jews they can buy. They just give, and the Jews will be more loyal because the Jews do not have loyalty to the local authority. And this is always the case. Franz Kafka spoke German, not Czech. He wrote in German, he didn't write in Czech. Because the Jews who lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire all spoke German because they identified with Vienna. My wife Ala comes from Ukraine. She grew up speaking Russian, not Ukrainian, for the same reason. And this is the same thing here. So that's an element as well. Another element, a third element, is the theological distinctions, which goes back to those passages that we looked at in the Bible, in the Torah and in Herodotus, about how the difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians over the sacrifice of animals. That the fortress of Knub, the temple of Knub happened to be a temple where they worshiped the ram. And the ram was that's the lamb, that's the Paschal sacrifice, right? A ram is a male sheep. So that's the Jews on Passover, right down the block from the temple, that's the temple of the ram god, are sacrificing lambs and rams so that they can feast and eat it. And that was angered the Egyptian, the local population as well. So that's a religious tension, and there's the political tension, and then there's the ethnic tension and the histories and the stories that they tell. All of these things come together in the story here, and this is exactly when the story of Purim is perhaps happening, and when the book of Esther is being written, and this is a real life issue where there is a destruction. What the story is the Persians then the empire does punish them. Vidranga is punished, and because he violated King Darius's law, and the Jews are allowed to rebuild their temple, though they're not allowed to offer sacrifices anymore. It says they're only allowed to do incense and meal offering. And there's a debate whether that was to satisfy the Egyptians. Some scholars say it was to satisfy the temple in Jerusalem, which after the Josianic reform represented the theology of Deuteronomy, which doesn't like there to be temples in other places outside Jerusalem. But they never quite get it back. And this is also a trope that follows through history, where even if the Jews are on the right by law that the synagogue shouldn't have been attacked, they still can't quite rebuild it, right? And they're still held down. And soon after, it's gone. And the record disappears from history and the community dies out there. Stacey.
It's also economic. They take and leaving the Jews penniless and without their silver. Again,
Yes, there is that economic. They do steal, and there's a quick economic basis. Just like Haman telling Ahasuerus, "I'm going to give you 10,000 talents." Here, they do steal the gold and the silver from the temple. It's a good, excellent point. Yeah.
With regards to the new kingdom and Ramses, I mean, everything that we've been learning today is basically our narrative.
Right.
Biblical, with the exception of Herodotus that you show us.
Right.
It's all our story. In Egypt, as you pointed out, there's literally no reference to the Israelites at all, except for one hieroglyph in one temple. So there's nothing about the plagues or the tragedy of the first one. Right. Nothing. Right. So is there some danger that we're interpreting our narrative retroactively because of our story much later?
Right. So the question is, are we reading the narrative right, are we creating the story, sort of going back to, yes, no, it's an excellent point. So this is from David Nirenberg's book, Ancient Judaism. He says, in the maps historians draw of the past, the landscape is always deformed by its future. To underline, that's a nice, right? We're always looking at something, and just putting aside the historicity of the Exodus, just in general, there's no way to tell the story of anti-Semitism without thinking of Hitler and the Holocaust. That's where we're going towards, right? That's where the story ends, right? Not entirely, because we're still living in it, but you can't, that's the big part of the story. So there is that. The history of and yes, there is the perspective, and I talked about our memory of it. So I said whether the story of Esther and Mordecai happened, whether the Exodus happened, it's more how we understood the world around us, but the representation of the prejudices of the Egyptians in Genesis and Exodus is confirmed by Herodotus, so I put that point there also. And finally, these are contemporary letters, these papyrus that were found. So it's the same time as Esther was written.
Much later than the Exodus from.
Of course, it would be later than the Exodus. We covered a broad swath of history. So yeah, the biblical origins are the haziest part of what we'll be talking about. As we move forward through the course of history, we'll be covering shorter periods with much greater amounts of evidence, right? And just going to grow that way, those two, and that will happen. We're at a time. But that's always the problem when we're looking at in ancient history in general, and certainly with the biblical period, that we're piecing it together based upon the fragments that we have. But my point is that this story about what happened in Elephant, it didn't come out of nowhere. So all we have are our memories, right, of how that are preserved in the Bible in terms of what brought to this real historical incident that occurred. We're going to resume next week. Next week is the continuation of the pre-Christian anti-Semitism, focus on the Greeks and the Romans. You can finish the chapter on ancient anti-Judaism in Nuremberg if you happen to be reading that, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Any other comments there? Questions for me?
There was just, was Daniel Darius?
No. Daniel is a Jewish sage. Darius is the Persian king. Okay. See you next week. Bye-bye. How many screens? Oh, I stopped the share.
We have 39 at the.
Okay.
No, because, listening to.
Yeah, let's find my cursor.
That's fascinating. I did not know anything about it.